Skills are a key mechanic in Payday 2, and they're easily one of the most fun parts of the game. They're a big part of why I, and many other people, keep going back to the game, as it just gives the game so much replayability from the sheer variety of builds that you can make with mixing different skills together. However, it's not exactly a perfect system, which is the topic of today's video, where we'll be going over some of the weird quirks that certain skills have. We've got bugged features, weird oversights in programming, and even a handful of weirdly worded descriptions. So without further ado, let's just get into it and start with Inspire Basic. Shouting at teammates with Inspire Basic increases their movement and reload speed by 20% for 10 seconds. What the skill doesn't mention though is that it has the hidden requirement of you needing to be within 9 meters of the person that you're shouting at to actually give them the buff, and there's a 3.5 second cooldown before you can get the buff out again. Confident Basic is a pretty simple skill, increasing the power and range of your intimidation by 25%. On the surface, this seems to be meant for controlling civilians and making cops surrender, but it has a weird quirk because of how the game handles shouting at people. Since the game treats shouting and marking out enemies the same way, not only does the skill make your shouts more effective, it also lets you mark out enemies from further away. Partners in Crime Ace increases your health by 30% if you have a converted cop, and also makes your converted cop take an additional 54% less damage. However, the increase to your health isn't quite what it seems to be. While it's written as being a 30% increase, it actually only increases your health by a flat 69. The extra 69 health comes from the skill being coded to use the base health value, as 30% 230 is 69. This makes sense from a balancing standpoint, as you'll be able to get some crazy amounts of health with some perk decks if you use your actual health value, but it's still a great skill nonetheless. Despite saying that the skill only counts during hostages or converted enemies, hostage take will work if there are any hostages on the map, regardless of if you took them or someone else did. It works as the description says for converted enemies though, as other players' converted enemies don't count for the effect. Despite the fact that the skill says that the weapon zoom level is increased by 25% for all weapons, the zoom increase from Rifleman Ace only applies to assault rifles, LMGs, sniper rifles, pistols, and SMGs. What's also strange is that it only applies to the single versions of pistols and SMGs, and not their akimbo variants as well. On the flip side though, the 100% reload speed increase from Aggressive Reload Ace actually applies to every weapon type, although you have to activate the buff as intended. This can be quite useful if you're playing with a sniper and have a secondary that has a long reload for example, as you can activate the buff on the sniper and then swap to your secondary for a quick reload. Sure, it's a bit cumbersome, but it's really fun for gimmicky setups, and I myself use it whenever I'm using the little friend in the Commando 101 together. Graves then has an interesting quote with how it does damage in its radius of effect. You can end up accidentally bottlenecking your damage with Graze, as the damage it deals to enemies is based off the damage it gets dealt to the original target, and not how much damage the shot actually did. The best way that I can explain this is to give the example of having both a light and a heavy SWAT standing next to each other. If you were to want to headshot kill the light SWAT, it'd only deal 480 damage to the heavy SWAT, since the light SWAT only took 480 damage, as it only has 480 health. If you did it the other way around though, and one tried to kill the heavy SWAT, it'd deal 480 damage to the light SWAT, since although the damage being dealt in the radius is 960, the light SWAT can't take more damage than it has health. Underdog Ace list of weapons that the damage buff doesn't apply to doesn't include flamethrowers, even though the buff doesn't apply to them. This is also true for Overkill Ace, as it reuses the same list from Underdog Ace. Transporter Ace only counts the base armor value and any additive bonuses it receives, but it doesn't count any multiplier bonuses. For example, while the ICTV has 221 armor and muscle and 280.5 on armor, since the base value of the ICTV is 170 and it's only getting increased by multipliers in both cases, it'll only reduce the penalty by 17% for both of them. Just to help explain it more, if you get Die Hard Ace on a ballistic vest, you'll reduce the penalty by another 2% as it's an additive bonus of 20 armor. What's also worth noting is that the armor increase you get from Anarchist is considered additive, so you get some incredible penalty reductions even in just the suit. Luckily, Shotgun or Ace is a much easier skill to explain with its quirk. While the knockback effect works on normal shield enemies, it doesn't work against martial shields. This is probably due to the fact that martial shields have special properties and are able to be destroyed, but it's still an annoying quirk to have to deal with. Scavenger Ace is a pretty neat skill that has a weird interaction with Graze. While the skill usually handles multi-kills pretty well, like from explosions, collaterals, or shotgun pellet spread, enemies killed by the Graze effect don't count towards Scavenger Ace's effect. Fully Loaded is a really quirky skill, both in its basic version and also in its Ace version. In the basic version, the skill increases your total ammo capacity by 25%. However, it only increases your total ammo capacity by 25% of the base total value for your weapons. It doesn't matter too much on its own, but it limits how much ammo you can get from it if you try and mix it with Akimbo Ace and Hitman. Now, Fully Loaded Ace was actually bugged for a really long time, where the increase of the chance of replenishing a throwable wasn't calculated correctly, but that's not the quirk I'm talking about this time. Despite the fact that the skill gives you the chance to get a throwable from an ammo box, Fully Loaded Ace doesn't replenish perk deck throwables, such as the Stoic Hip Flask for example. This makes sense from a balancing standpoint, as it would be pretty overpowered to be able to regenerate them from ammo pickups on top of how they're meant to be normally regenerated. To make things even weirder though, the Team AA Boost Stockpiler, which replenishes the throwable for every 35 kills you make, does actually apply to perk deck throwables. When picking a secondary deployable Jack of all trades aced, it'll round up the amount of the deployable you have after halving it. This is hardly noticeable, as the only two ways to have an odd amount of a deployable is having up as basic or more firepower basic, but it's still a neat quirk the skill has. Fire Control Basic works really well with LMG bipods. Since using a bipod on the LMG is still considered hip firing, it applies the accuracy buff even though you're laying on the ground and aiming the LMG. I'm not going to complain, but it's very strange. Surefire Basic gives you an extra 30 rounds in your magazines instead of the usual 15 if you're using akimbo SMGs to account for the fact that they are quite literally 2 SMGs. Lock and load ace is a very weird skill. The reload speed buff is able to be activated and then used on every weapon that's being fired in full auto, so it also includes automatic shotguns. The skill's description doesn't mention it, but the reload speed buff gets cleared whenever you swap to another weapon or if you cancel your reload. Since the skill is programmed to give you the buff after making 2 kills while the gun's in full auto, you can actually activate the skill in full auto and then swap the gun to semi-auto, but still keep the faster reload. The skill also doesn't check if you've killed enemies with automatic weapons, but instead checks if you've gotten kills while you're holding an automatic weapon. It's worth noting that sentries and melee kills don't count towards the effect, but everything else is fair game for activating the skill in the most roundabout way possible. Body expertise is a fairly straightforward skill, giving you a percentage of the bonus headshot damage your weapon would do and applying it permanently to your body shots and automatic weapons. The skill has a discrepancy between what headshot damage you actually do and what damage the skill thinks you do though, because it only uses headshot multipliers for its calculations and doesn't take into account the damage increase from helmet popping. Helmet popping is the second card in every perk deck, and it increases the headshot damage due by 25%, and since it doesn't account for the extra 25%, it ends up thinking that your headshots do less damage than they actually do in reality. While it's not quite as interesting, the skill also doesn't apply to bulldozers. At a first glance, Sixth Sense Ace seems like a fairly simple skill. You stand still for 3.5 seconds in stealth, and it automatically marks out every enemy within 10 meters of you. However, it's a pretty janky skill, and its description isn't fully correct either. While you're allowed to do pretty much anything while standing still, interacting with anything that has a timer will cancel the ability. The skill doesn't just mark out enemies, as it also marks out civilians as well. The description also doesn't mention the fact that after you wait the 3.5 seconds to do the marking effect, it will do the marking effect again for every second that you stay still. Nimble Basic's description doesn't mention the fact that you can't re-loop cameras until the last 5 seconds of the loop, or after the loop ends. While duck and cover ace is meant to give you an extra 10% dodge while sprinting, and an extra 15% dodge when a zipline, you actually only get the increase while sprinting, and you don't get any change to your dodge whatsoever when using a zipline. Shockproof Basic gives you a 30% chance for the taser's tasing effect to backfire on them. What the skill doesn't tell you though is that this chance gets rolled every second while you're being tased, so that measly 30% ends up being pretty good odds to be able to just shrug it off. Need Basic makes the first shot that you land on every enemy stagger them after your armor breaks, with the effect ending after your armor regenerates. Interestingly though, it only counts normal armor regeneration, so if you regenerate armor in any other way than just waiting for it to regenerate, you'll be able to stagger enemies with the skill. However, despite the fact that the skill says that every enemy can be staggered, bulldozers can't be staggered by the effect. It's also completely useless on Anarchist, as since the game always considers you to be generating armor, you can never stagger enemies with it. Second Wind also follows the same logic, and you can never get the speed boost with it if you're using Anarchist. High Value Target Ace is a great skill, but its description completely misses the fact that it increases your marking range by a whopping 2000%. With Unseen Strike, you start every heist with the increase to your crit chance active for some reason. The skill also doesn't actually check if you've lost armor or health, but instead just checks if you've taken damage from being shot or being hit by an explosion, as taking damage from falling, gas, or fire doesn't affect the skill at all. Similarly to fully loaded Ace, the Akimbo Ace will only increase the total ammo capacity of Akimbo weapons by 50% of the base value, and not 50% of what the current total ammo value is. Desperado gives you an increase to your accuracy whenever you shoot an enemy with a pistol, however, the buff gets completely cancelled whenever you swap to another weapon that isn't also another pistol. Now, it's a bit anticlimactic, but our final skill, Trigger Happy, has the same quirk as Desperado, where its buff gets cancelled if you swap to a non-pistol weapon. I found out about most of these quirks just from playing the game for ages, but there are a handful that I found thanks to the long guide, the link to which is down in the description below if you'd like to check it out for yourself. While I think I managed to cover everything in this video, there's always a chance that I missed some skills, so feel free to drop a comment down below if there's any that managed to slip through the cracks. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help me out. As usual though, I've been Cookie Dough, and have a good one.